Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and esteemed participants. Welcome to another enlightening session brought to you by Taylor's University School of Education, Impact Lab Education for All. Our mission is to create an educational landscape that embraces diversity, inclusivity, and empowers every learner. My name is Denise, and it's an honor to be your MC for today's roundtable discussion on culturally responsive and sustaining education. What is it, why it matters, and how do we do it? It is important to note that this roundtable session is a professional dialogue aimed at fostering insightful discussion. As such, there won't be any PowerPoint slides projected during the session later. Before we delve into our discussion, please take a moment to ensure that your microphones are muted throughout the session. We encourage you to actively engage by using the chat box for questions and comments. And I would also like to inform that this session is being recorded for future references and also to share on our YouTube channel later for those who couldn't make it today. Now, just a quick virtual group photo as our usual drill. So may I invite everyone to turn on their cameras and give us their best smiles. So I'll give you about 2-3 seconds to do that. Stop sharing and I'll get ready to take our beautiful photos. Thank you, everybody. Okay, in a count of 1, 2, 3, smile. All right. I've just got 2 pages, so bear with me. And one more. Oh, one more. All right, now, our discussion today will be, thank you very much, everybody, for turning on your cameras. Now, our discussion today will be expertly guided by someone with a deep understanding of our topic. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Associate Professor Dr. Pauline Goh, a Senior Research Fellow from the School of Education, Taylor's University. Dr. Goh will lead us through this enriching conversation, and I now hand the floor over to Dr. Pauline Goh, who will introduce our esteemed speakers and facilitate our roundtable discussion today. Over to you, Dr. Goh.
Thank you, Denise. How lovely. All right. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and probably good evening to our international speakers over there. Well, as Denise said, I'm Pauline, and I will be the moderator for today's session for the next hour. Now, of course, the first thing is a huge welcome to everyone, from us, the hosts, Taylor's University, and also Taylor's University Impact Labs. And of course, right now, I must introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. First off, Associate Professor Dr. Logendra, hello, needs no introduction. For those who are new here, Dr. Logan is the head of school of the Science School of Education under the Faculty of Social Sciences and Leisure Management. Besides his achievement for the School of Education, which is really too long to go into right now, he has also spearheaded the Taylor's University Impact Lab under Education for All. He and his team has initiated various community projects for vulnerable individuals and communities. Hello, Logan.
Hello.
Nice to have you here. So our international speakers are Professor Dr. Damian Blake. Hello. And Associate Professor Bonnie Yim. Yes, hello, Damian, Bonnie. So good to have you both with us today. Professor Damian is the head of School of Education under the Faculty of Arts and Education, Deakin University. He is also an active member of the Victorian Council of Deans of Education and the Australian Council of Deans of Education. Associate Professor Dr. Bonnie Yim, hello, is currently the Associate Dean of International and Engagement and has initiated many cross-borders alignments between Deakin University and universities worldwide, Taylor's University included. So I must add that I've known Damian and Bonnie for many years, and we are indeed very privileged to have them with us today. So I guess before we begin our session today, I would like to hand the platform over to Dr. Logan for your opening remark. Dr.
Okay,
Logan?
thank you, Pauline. Greetings, Damian and Bonnie. Thanks everyone else. I know from a Malaysian perspective, today is an important day. It's called Traveling Day because tomorrow is election. So, but in spite of that, logging on this time of the day, and we are grateful. Now, coming back to the conversation today, there was this big issue about a lot of conversation, especially because we work in the Impact Lab. There were a lot of conversation about sustainability. And there were a lot of conversation about learning sustainability. You know, there was sustainability in tourism, there was sustainability in engineering, construct, medicine, and a whole bunch of fields. But what was missing, at least that's what I felt, what was missing in the conversation, it's not so much about learning about sustainability, but learning sustainability in a context where the learning is perpetual. Learning could be lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep. So that was a concept that brought upon this discussion when I had initially with Dr. Pauline, and then subsequently Dr. Pauline found her friends who want to be part of this conversation. And I hope today the conversation will be meaningful, and it may trigger, especially for those of our students who are doing PhD and going to listen to this now or subsequently in the workshop. This may trigger a whole bunch of new a new direction in your research question, and hopefully you may find this very fruitful. So with that, back to you, Dr. Pauline.
Thank you so much, Dr. Logan. Yes, I guess just to add on to what you just said, you know, I think most of us would agree that with me that when we come to education, there's always a sea of buzzwords. You know, I think terms like personalized learning was very popular at one time. Differentiation, formative assessment, which is still ongoing, and right now what we have is culturally responsive and sustaining education. You know, so this teaching trend sometimes can take wings. Yet the terms can sometimes mean different things to different people. And in education, especially, whenever confusion appears, ineffectiveness can sometimes be very close behind. You know, how we actually sort of cut out those meanings, you know. Therefore, what we are doing today is we are going to deep dive into what exactly culturally responsive and sustaining education is, why it matters, and how we as educators, you know, even students who are here, can work towards it. So probably I'm going to call upon our international speaker, maybe Damian. Would you like to start the ball rolling? Maybe I would ask you a simple question to start you off. What does, you know, sustainability mean in the educational context, and what different perspectives are there on its existence? Damian, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Great question. Thanks, Pauline, and thanks for getting us started, and thanks for for inviting us. You know, it is a wonderful opportunity. I will just, before I answer that, respond by acknowledging that I'm in a culturally responsive way talking to you from what we call Wadawurrung country, which is the traditional lands of the owners who lived, you know, in Australia on this particular land for 40,000 years. And just to acknowledge that in that sense. But the question about sustaining education, sustainability, it's a good one, because the word sustainability is used so widely, and as Dr. Logan, you said, everyone has a definition of sustainability. You know, for quite a long time, we were thinking about sustainability in terms of fossil fuels and chopping down trees and environment and impact and those sorts of things. But, you know, within the context of education, you know, which I think is the most critical, you know, area to think about sustaining learning, and, you know, sustaining learning throughout our whole life. On the one hand, you know, from what we often call lifelong and life-wide learning, but then really understanding the phenomenon of education which does start to move into those areas of understanding culture and cultural differences, which I know we will probably get into a bit later on. If we are to live in the world, we need to live sustainably, not just in terms of our economic resources and in terms of our access, to things that we need on a daily basis. It needs to be sustainable and sustaining in terms of how we treat each other, and how we relate to each other, and even to the point where we start to question some of the assumptions about how we see and understand the world, and not just us personally, but the people that we live with. When I start our conversation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking from, that is actually moving towards a more sustainable way of learning about the world, because it is acknowledging that before Europeans, mostly Europeans, were colonizing this country, our indigenous Australians were here for a long time, and that actually means re-understanding the way our culture in Australia has been over the last couple of years, and the way it will go into the future. So that really points to the question of how we can sustain a life together. From an Australian context, Australia is a very multicultural country. Our people in our communities come from all walks of life in the world. And in your average classroom where children and teachers are learning, it is about understanding how sustaining learning within that environment is as much about recognizing who's in the environment and what the values are and what the differences are, and really valuing the differences as a part of learning, as opposed to previous times, which might have been more about trying to teach one way of seeing the world, which doesn't work for anybody. I think we know that now. So sustaining education is actually about changing the way historically, many people of the world have understood what education is. But it also means moving beyond this notion that education is just about the brain and learning facts and figures and bits and pieces. So you can pass a test. It's actually learning in a way that's much more sophisticated than that requires you to see the way others see the world and understand the way others see the world, so that you may learn from them, but at the same time learn more about yourself in the process. And for me, that's pointing towards what sustaining education is about.
Right. What about you, Logan, from a perspective of maybe our Malaysian context,
Yeah. So I would like to start off where, when Damian talked about see and understanding the world as a point. And that's a very interesting point, because one part of sustainable learning is, or at least culturally responsive learning, it's different at different part of the world. Damian talked about colonization, or the Western colonization, and the whole idea of understanding culturally responsive education seemed to be from the post-colonial perspective. But post-colonial perspective from the European point of view is slightly different, or there are more contexts can be viewed. Like, for example, I did my undergraduate in the States, and there was a lot of discussion about colonization, the same way as Damian talking about the Aborigine. There they talk about the Native Americans. So the way I want to, at least for future direction for our young researchers to consider, is how different models of colonization has impacted the cultural responsiveness. So, for example, you have the majority versus the majority immigrant population, like the US, Australian, Canadian model, where there are overwhelming majority of immigrants dominating the landscape. So how then the culturally responsive education can take place? Then you have immigration and mainstream, like, for example, the French situation, where you have a bunch of immigrants going in and trying to emulate and assimilate into the setting. And then the relationship between the native population, which predominantly Europeans, and the new immigrant population, and the context, how education needs to take place. And then you have a post-colonial amalgamation model, like for example, the Middle East, where a whole bunch of countries were artificially divided post-colonial and historical time. And then even like Malaysia, you know, in Malaysia, especially since the election is just tomorrow and there's so much of conversation, there's the context of the country has changed, and how the impact of how we see each other and how we respect each other and we educate an environment where we can sustainably learn, live, and grow together needs to be seen, because they are not just one model. There are multiple models, and I guess we can see the relationship between each variables in a constructive way moving forward.
Bonnie, do you have something to add to that? I mean, there's a lot already to get, but
I absolutely agree. And also I like the idea that Damian mentioned about how we see the world. When we talk about the world, we talk about two things, human and non-human factors. So how we see those two things, it really depends on our experience and also our background. As Dr. Logan mentioned about, it can be linked with our, let's say, if you are coming from a migrant background, or are you born and bred in that particular region, that will impact on how we see the human and the non-human issues. So while I am elaborating on my idea, I would also like to invite people in this room. Can you let me know which parts of the world you are physically in now? So welcome to put a note in the chat box. Let me know the region or country you are physically in. I know we have a very big group of people. Even within Malaysia, you're welcome to share with me which part of Malaysia you are currently. As Dr. Logan mentioned, you will have the election tomorrow. I know there might be some traveling involved because of the arrangement in your country. So welcome to put some of the information there. So you can see on the chat box, well, even we are in the world, but again, some people will see the sustainability or sustaining education only from one part. Let's say if you're working as a teacher in Malaysia, you might coming from the Malaysian context because of the governance, because of the regulation, because of the policy. So I think all this we can go deeper later during the ongoing conversation. But if we talk about the mobility, because these days, children, young people are very, very mobile. It's very hard to talk about, well, which region you belong to. For example, some of us might start off in Malaysia, but later, as Logan mentioned, well, you finish your degree in another country, and then later migrate and work in another country. So I think this global perspective and also the mobility will impact on how we define the word sustainability or sustaining education. And also to define the word culture, the word culture is now very challenging. I can see in the chat box now, well, even within this group, we have 3 pages of participants here. You can see such a wide range of region and country where we are from. So when we define the word culture, I think we need to make sure we acknowledge this group where we are currently in, maybe physically in one place, but we may link with more than one place and one culture. So this is where I'm coming from. Thank you, Pauline.
Thanks, Bonnie. Actually, before we sort of go on with the other conversation, can I just ask someone to nitpick, the definition between culturally responsive and culturally sustaining. Would anyone dare to sort of like try to nitpick that difference, culturally responsive versus culturally sustaining? I think before we even dive into the topic, probably we want to have a tiny bit of this definition. Would anyone want to attempt that one? Culturally responsive versus culturally sustaining.
It's worth noting that culturally responsive, is, I mean, if you're thinking of it as a teacher, as an educator, from that point of view, it actually influences and forms what you do and how you relate to your students, you know, in a way that recognizes and sees, you know, to use that word, sees the cultures and the differences, you know, because I mean, when we think about culture, we can think about food and art and those sorts of things, but you know, when we talk at a deeper level, you know, we talk about, you know, going beyond culture, being much more inclusive to all of those people and what makes us different, you know, within your class. So in being responsive to the differences and not seeing differences as something negative, but seeing differences as something positive and defining the way you act and react, you know, within the culture of your classroom. But remember, the culture of your classroom is made up of lots of different cultures and differences and perspectives of the world. So probably even seeing that it's not you bring what your view is and your culture, but also valuing, you know, the differences of others as well. And sustaining, you know, is more about, as Logan had said earlier, it is about you know, an education which does foster that lifelong learning, that continuing learning, you know, but it's not learning new stuff. It's not just learning more things. It's actually learning how to be in the world in that phenomenological sense. And to be in the world defines as much about, you know, the way you challenge your own perceptions and things that you take for granted, you know, in ways that make living together more sustainable, I think. And to do that, you need to be learning continuously. I often confront things that change the way I see the world, and then, you know, that's a threshold moment that changes you forever in that sense.
Great. Anyone like to add on before I just jump on to another one, which is very similar to that difference?
This is important, because when Damian said about seeing the differences, actually, in Malaysia, we try to legislate this. We had all kind of modules in the government has imposed on the universities to talk about intercultural, intracultural, and all this stuff. But those modules are introduced to the students more like an encyclopedia, catalogical. You know, this is what an Indian is, this is what a Chinese is, this is what a Malay is, this is how an Aborigine Malay looks like. But what we probably need to do beyond that is not to recognize the differences, but to also focus on the psychological phenomenon that why we need to be identified. The security, I mean, because whether we like it or not, I don't know what being an Indian is. I just know what being me is. Someone decided to call me an Indian, right? So therefore, I became an Indian. If I was the only man on earth, I wouldn't be known as an Indian, right? Because that identity only came because the other exists. If the others are eliminated, then I don't need an identity. But I think one of the things that in the context of our argument just now, one big part as pedagogy should be on the from the emotional, the need and the genealogy of a culture, and why we identify, and because once we know that all cultures have similar components just manifesting differently, then the gap between cultures collapses. You know, it's like we both telling you, if you like a particular nutritious meal and I like a particular meal because I'm culturally attached to the meal. Once we break it down to the nutrients and the components of food, then the differences cease to exist. So one of the things that I wish if I had opportunity is to actually develop exposure to young students about the need for culture as opposed to the variance in culture. And also
that's a big one. That's a big one.
One more thing, Pauline, is also to bring the argument closer to home, because we generally talk about culture as a historical thing. You know, in Malaysia, Damian and Bonnie, we are beginning to experience, at least in Taylor's, we have this small new issues of this wokeness is beginning to set foot. You know, we are relatively a conservative country and a conservative communist society as in general. This whole notion of wokeness is now creeping into the system. then how do we then accommodate this? And again, it's an issue of identity. And why do people need to affirm their identity? Why do they need to cling to communities where the identity is reinforced? If we understand that, then we are more open to different people and different beliefs.
Wow, wow, that's a big one, Logan. You know,
No, but these are
coming
issues that
to
are
culture
taking...
and identity. Yes, I know. So, but I mean, yeah, I guess that would be an important conversation, you know. But back to what you also mentioned just now is about culture. You know, I mean, what you're saying is, I'm saying that there is some cultural issues.
Yeah.
Each of us are having this problem of being identify ourselves, or we want to be, I'm Chinese, you are Indian, so you have a different culture, I have a different culture, and it's just not melting together to produce one identity that we can call, say, for instance, Malaysian, or we can call Australian. I think that's what you are getting at, you know. So if you go back to education, how do you think then we as, you know, educators or researchers or even students consider such cultural issues together with sustainability from an inclusive perspective? Bonnie, you want to take that one?
Sure.
All the conversation has been very tough ones actually. Logan has thrown us a very important topic there, you know, to be added into today's theme.
Definitely. Happy to start the ball rolling from here. So from an inclusive way to consider culture and also sustainability, I think I can think of 3 letter C. So I put it in the chat box here. So start with, you can choose something, you can create something, and you can consider something. So I put it in the chat box. So let me elaborate on each of them. So to be inclusive, that means everyone can have their voice, and also everyone can pick something based on their need and their interest and also their background. So I think it's more about make sure we have the choices for the learner, and also we have the choices in the education system so that we can accommodate the diverse learners' need. Culture is one of the things they will bring into the classroom, and which is part of us. But other than that, I'm sure there's so many other things. So if we have choices or if we have options, that will be more inclusive in so many ways. And also people feel enabled or empowered to do something. Second C I can think of is about create, which is to, again, create opportunity for others to join the conversation. So for example, now we have the chat box here. So everyone's very welcome to pop something in the chat box. That means there's an opportunity for people to join in if they want to. They can turn the mic on, they can put the words in the chat box. And even Pauline, you did a wonderful job, is to really allow everyone to join in. And same case for Denise, put a small note in the chat box. So all these are opportunity to be more inclusive and also to promote the culture and also a positive culture, even within the current community in Zoom now. The third C I can consider is the word consider, which is the very important. I mentioned about the human and the non-human factor. In a learning context, we need to also consider the physical and the non-physical environment that we create for our learners, and also for us as a learner to learn ourselves too. So the physical environment can be a very simple things like a children's book, for example. I have a book in front of me. Well, make sure we choose something which can really benefit every single learners in the context. So this is a physical part. For the non-physical part, think about my body language. Think about the word that I chose to present the idea, and also the way I interact, my manner. Very simple things. Those are non-physical things you can't touch, but it will definitely impact on how people feel included in the whole conversation. So I will stop here and I will hand it to Damian and Dr. Logan to have some more ideas from there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on some of your points there, Bonnie. I think, you know, on the theme of inclusion, as educators, you know, I see it that we either include or exclude. It's rarely somewhere in between. And through our actions and activity, it's just a matter of whether we are aware. And when we talk about culture, again, it's easier to talk about Malaysian culture, Chinese culture, Indonesian culture, and things that identify with our nations and our people, and places that we've come from or live in. But if we start to think about diversity and inclusion, so take this notion of culture to diversity, and we start to understand that sometimes it can be uncomfortable, for all of us, when we start to think about things like disability, or, even framing disability as disability, as opposed to other ways of thinking about abilities. When we talk about gender, when we talk about neurodiversity, the challenge is for us seriously to think about people as being multi-diverse. So, being an educator is such a complex job, I think, to be able to relate to people in the world through their multi-diversities and to be inclusive, and to be aware that when you inevitably one day make a mistake, that you learn from that mistake, because up until that point in time you have been exclusive to people with a particular disability, or you haven't understood, like the book, one strategy in addressing it, Bonnie's book, how do we include people in a book? We include them in writing the book in the first place. So this notion of co-developing things as educators, co-designing, co-creating, I think opens the possibilities, to how we can be more inclusive in practical ways that goes beyond the concept of culture in a more simplistic, but becomes more about inclusion as an educator.
Right. Yes, Luca, you have anything to add?
Yeah.
Because, yes.
I mean, the whole idea is, again, Damian brought an interesting point that it is beyond culture, as in geography. There's also communities that are being formed. And to know that culture is a transitional phenomenon, it's constantly evolving. I am sure my forefathers didn't interpret being Indian the way I interpret being Indian. There's a whole definition has evolved over the time. And people must be aware that our identity is in transient, it's always constantly moving. So the biggest challenge here for each, because once again, I accidentally, and I didn't mean to bring up the notion of identity, but since it is out there, we are equally responsible for the perception of the other. As a Malaysian Indian, I can't go and say, oh, it's about me, it's about my personal freedom to communicate. And so we teach people to talk about identity or talk about their culture from their perspective. But what is really, really important to have an inter-perspective disposition. How would a Chinese view me if I had to say stupid things like this? Recently, as I said, I'm unfortunately very caught up with the political election campaign, so that everybody keeps saying from their point of view, and they seldom view the issue from another perspective. So one part of an educator is not only bringing awareness of the need for identity and why all of us have an identity, and identity is not unique. It's more of the psychological phenomenon that is unique, not the social context, but also this inter-perspective disposition. How do others view us and how do we view others? And there are more similarities and differences, especially when now there are more dimensions to worry about rather than ethnic origin, because as what Damian said, as educators, we are now becoming more sensitive to diversity in so many forms, particularly now with technology being intervened, social media being there, diversity is even more fragmented. And these are issues that young educators need to be more concerned about moving forward.
Can
Yeah,
I just
we
add
have
one
got.
more point there?
Sorry, yes,
Pauline?
sorry. Continue.
Sorry.
Damian, you have something to say?
Yeah, and this is linking to the point about sustainability. because, you know, and action as you know, in dealing with multi-diversity and seeing the world, you know, and part of the reason, you know, why in Australia we do acknowledge country, you know, I mean, there's also an acknowledgement that of history and historical conflicts and damage done and things like that, you know, and our discussion earlier about colonization is a big part of that, I think, you know, as in there's the need for educators to be a part of healing.
Correct.
So the world just didn't start when we were born, you know, the world has a history, and, you know, as an educator, you have a role in undoing or repairing some of the damage that's been done prior to you coming to this earth, and some of the damage that continues to be done in the name of, you know, what we see, you know, happening across the world at the moment. So it's about that multi-diversity, but it's also about repair and healing.
Right. Okay, actually we have two important, there are two responses from the chats that I think they're quite relevant, you know, and I think the next question would be to Logan and Damian, because you are both deans of the School of Education. Okay, I think the question in general is, what are the challenges that culturally responsive leaders should be aware of? I think what we are seeing also, there is some, I think, Logan, what you're saying in the way, in summary, is there's bias, you know, there's fear. And I think, Bonnie, what you're saying is sometimes there's also a lack of cultural awareness, you know, the absence of professional strategies and sort of adequate, there might be inadequate support structures. And I think what Professor Moses is saying, that the threats, how do we address these threats? Like just what I mentioned, fear, you know, bias, lack of cultural awareness, absence of professional strategies and adequate support structures. How would you, you know, two leaders, Logan and Damian, how would you handle this?
Damian, you want to go first? That gives me time to pick up
one of the
very important one.
One of the things that we did just in time for the pandemic to start in Geelong was we built a machine, and, you know, I always wanted to build a machine called a Pegatron, you know, something that was very expensive, so I created the word. But basically what the machine is, an immersive learning lab. And what it does is allow people to view an experience in 360 degrees. You know, in this sophisticated theatre that we've created, we record it with our 360-degree cameras, and then they move. They don't just view it on their own. They view it with others who will see other bits and pieces differently, and then they move into something called the think tank. But, you know, let's take a practical example like teaching young children to read. You know, so we've recorded footage, 360-degree footage of a very competent young female teacher in one of our schools who's very, very skilled, has good classroom control, you know, and she has her you know, grade 2 students sitting around her in front of her, and she's using a mini lesson to actually teach, and you're in that classroom with her, with others, and you're watching that, but you're in the 360-degree lab. You're not actually there, so you can see things from a different perspective now. The thing that you start to see is the competence and the skills and all of the infrastructure that she puts in that classroom that allows her to have students to be self-directed, for example. You see those things that good teachers do that helps her manage a classroom. But then you start to see other things, you know, that you can't unseen, and they are biases. They are things that then you can start to predict, oh, that boy is actually going to have trouble in 3 years. You know, well, actually, one of the things you do see is the boys can't sit still longer than 5 minutes, you know, because before they all start. So you actually see things about gender differences between the boys and the girls, and that particular strategy for teaching, you know, in early reading, for example, we may well have thought for a long time, you know, boys just take longer to read. Well, actually, if you see the way teaching strategies are used you actually see that it's not working for some of them, you know, and a lot of them are the boys in that classroom. So how do you address those challenges? I think we need the opportunities for educators to have deep learning experiences with ideas like what we call an imaginarium, a 360-degree immersive learning. They're relatively expensive, but if you could create more opportunities for teachers to learn from each other, to be in each other's classrooms, but they need to have the right set of lenses to be in their classrooms, each other's classrooms. They need to have the right attitude. So it's not just about learning more skills, it's actually about, seeing things more deeply and being open to that deeper sort of learning. So I could go on about that, but I better not. So Logan, I better leave some space for you there.
Yeah, I think what Prof. Moses is trying to say is, I mentioned a few things like bias and lack of cultural awareness. I think Prof. Moses is asking, what do we see as the main threats to culturally responsive and sustainable education experience?
So from a Malaysian perspective, because we spend a lot of time on identity and although the government is pushing for assimilation, the community leaders tend to not to do that. So one of the things that we should educate, especially those who are doing social science and those on a higher grade level, is focus on sometimes having an identity, whether it's gender or culture, geography, ethnic identity. It could be a sense of entrapment. You could be entrapped into an identity that restricts that kind of encourages cognitive dissonance, in the sense that you will stop exploring because it's not meant for me, it's not me. So instead of one of the things, especially, the same thing happens in gender, right? Especially, I don't know whether I made the right decision or not. I had the chance to send my daughter to secondary school. I read a whole bunch of literature, whether to send her to a co-ed school or a mixed gender school. So I've read a lot of literature written, at least from an African perspective, that giving girls opportunity in a single co-ed, single ed school or single gender school, gives them more opportunity to exercise their leadership quality because they are not artificially restricted. This is purely a Malaysian context, right? They are not artificially restricted by gender. But what I failed to see, so my daughter goes to a Catholic girls' school called St. Mary in KL. But what has happened is the teachers are more constricted because they have adapted their specific role as a woman in the country. So the artificial constraint is not so much put by men on women, it's by women who have bought into the narrative, imposing onto young girls about what is their role in society. So that's why I feel sometimes talking to people about identity, although it's great to have an identity, it gives you a sense of security, it gives you a sense of comfort, but it also can be an entrapment. So also to encourage that identity is a locus of a circle. It's like if you learn maths, talk about center of the circle and then the radius. So the more you intellectually explore, the bigger the circle you get, as opposed to say that, now this is a circle I was born in, or this is a circle I identify with, and then you're stuck. So those are the things that we, at least as I said, because we are now recrafting the Malaysian higher ed curriculum in the compulsory subject department. So these are the things that maybe we should really push for as part of more
cultural awareness.
Cultural awareness.
I guess, Bonnie, I need to throw you a curveball. Do you think that just now what you mentioned about your 4 C's, right? Your 3 C's, would that be part of a professional strategy and a framework or a support structure? Is that would I call that a support structure, professional strategy?
Very good question, Pauline. I think, well, we can, if we are going to develop a framework, I think I can give you more than 3 C's then. So we can just keep growing so that we can really, well, the next C will be comprehensiveness, whether we can really comprehensive enough to cover
There
everything.
you go. There you go.
So,
it's a future research there, isn't it? But I think back to the question of this, are we having enough professional support for teachers, to be culturally responsive and sustaining education. Do we have that right now in Australia? Let's say in Deakin, for instance.
I
We
think
don't have much time, maybe another 2-3 minutes for each one of us, but that is a question that I'm quite interested to know.
Sure. The word enough is never enough. So as you mentioned right in the beginning of our conversation, lifelong learning. So I think that is the key message that I personally would like to encourage everyone's here to reflect and rethink. Because culture keep emerging, as Logan mentioned earlier, because it's really moving, it's not stable. So even you have some kind of professional development today, it doesn't mean it will cover everything happens in the next 3 to 5 years. So 10 years ago, no one actually thought about we can be so relied on our little device called mobile phone. So we really don't know what could happen in the next 5 or 10 years in terms of the emerging of the AI,
True.
as we briefly mentioned earlier. So I would say the word enough may not be a good one to start with, but actually think about always to keep learning and make sure you show interest and you show empathy, you show passion in the learning.
Right. I mean, as usual, time always go ahead of us, and there's never, like you say, Bonnie, there's never enough. So this is not, there's never enough time. We have already reached about 3:46, So what I'll do is just to do a little short recap, and then we'll go into the Q&A. I think there's a few Q&A, very interesting questions that I think the panel speakers would like to share, So what I'm saying is I hope that, today's sharing has provided a clearer definition of culturally responsive and sustaining education. We hear from Logan, tying it to things like identity. Damian, you showed us some examples of what you have been doing, the 360, and Bonnie, probably a new research in the framework of 3C plus another C coming up, wonderful. So I think most of you will agree with me that every learning institutions will have a different context towards the goal of having a culturally responsive and sustaining education, right? But I hope that today's session can encourage all of us to use the ideas as a springboard and consider what each of us can start doing tomorrow itself, however small, So I think now I will open the session to anyone who has something to ask or to share with a panel of speakers. And we do have a question from Dr. Logendra, right? I'm going to read the question now so that the panel of speakers can give some thought to it. What are the values that we need to inculcate among students to create cultural awareness in our multicultural classroom? I think Australia is also considered a multicultural classroom. Who wants to start off this one?
I might probably start and also
Thank you,
link it
Bonnie.
back.
Yes.
And also link it back to Pauline's question, whether Deakin has something on really promoting the vision and the mission and the value. And I just put the link here because it's a publicly available web page and very welcome to have a click on it. So I think those are the 3 key terms, also answer Jenna's question. So in this web page, you can see the 3 keywords are diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think these are the 3 values that we personally would like to achieve and also promote and include it in our day-to-day teaching and learning in Deakin University.
Right, thank you.
Maybe if I could add to that too, being a fellow Deaconite, of course, I think those are values that are, an important part of our institution. But, when in education, we often talk about if we value something, we measure it. And this is where I think in education broadly, we have experienced discontinuities between the things we measure and the things that we say we value often. we often talk about PISA and tests and exams that pressure teachers to teach in particular ways that sometimes are contradictory, to the things that we really value. So I think to the point of values, we need to teach that those things are valuable, and often people will agree that they're valuable, but we need to go the next step to have effective measures to say, well, actually, we value this, and look, we're not doing as well as we thought we would, based on these measures. Or, what, we could do a lot more in that particular area. And that drives more conversation about what we value, I think.
My 2 cents worth. I would like to, this is, I don't know whether you all follow hockey. There was a ice hockey player called Wayne Gretzky. He's quite popular in the States, although he's a Canadian born. So one of his quotation that brings resonance to this argument is, I skate where the puck is going to be and not where it has been. So one of the issue here is the responsive culturally. Is it to preserve a past culture or to create a new culture? So that is one of the things that as educators, because one of the things, although we are market-driven, market-sensitive industry, like at least when Taylor's being part of a private institution, our bosses keep telling us to be responsive to the market needs and all that. We are also responsible as educators and pedagogues to create the market. So it's not about responding to what everybody wants now, but also to use our judgment and our learning to create an opportunity where the future is certainly better than the past. So I feel one of the things as educators we should do is to eliminate our wisdom, collective wisdom, to see how we can move this cultural appropriation, because it's a big challenge in a context, at least in Malaysia, it's a big challenge.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just like to share one of the chat by Dr. Nohayati Maskat. What she's saying is, I guess getting students to tell about their culture on the first day of school would be a good idea to be aware of each other's culture. This is the first step of understanding each other. I think that's quite interesting, that you come to the first day, let's talk about each other's culture, especially in Malaysia. I think we tend to assume that, oh, you are Indian, I know your culture, I'm Chinese, you know our culture. I think by talking about it, gets us a better understanding of each other, I think. So thank you very much, Dr. Maskat, for that comment.
And also to that, because I'm very sensitive to the otherness. I don't know, yes. I seem to be very obsessed with that idea. We should recognize that the otherness is an artificial boundary. Because we live in a cocoon, so the otherness are created. So one young thing that we can work with young people is to break the divide of us and other. Because to define, especially because in Malaysia, we are not only divided by race, we are also theologically divided. So there are many parameters that are keeping us apart. And the otherness become very apparent very quickly. So for young educators, particularly working with a bit more matured kids, so this may not work in primary, maybe in the upper secondary schools, is to define the otherness and the need why we create this boundary is an important factor to consider.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Logan. I think as educators, good educators are boundary crossers. Correct. Aren't they? And the thing that they do is they're also skilled negotiators, because they know how to cross boundaries in ways that are safe and sustaining and sustainable in that sense to create new culture.
Yes. Thanks, Damian. Last words, Bonnie?
I agree. And well, when you talk about responsiveness, it seems like something happened, that's why we respond. So there seems to be a cause and consequence. But what I would like to promote is being more proactive. So don't wait something happen and then you respond. So be proactive and don't stay silent. When you see something, when you want to make something change, when you want to include people in your group, go and do it now. Don't wait until something happens. So be proactive.
Great. I think that we have come to almost the end, but we have 1 minute. There's one burning question, I think, from one of the participant, because I think it's following what Logan you mentioned about otherness. How do we eradicate the boundaries and the others in education? Yes.
So to me, I'm speaking of first-hand experience. When I went to the States as an undergraduate student, I went there as your typical bigot. So, and fortunately, there was an elective called World Religion, Philosophy and World Religion. And that really created a big impact on me, and probably half the things I'm saying now, it's due to the class that I picked up in my college years, is to understand first your construct of your identity. Once you can divide the tree from the forest, right, you can really say, okay, this is why I am who I am, and this is why I keep calling myself this. And then you say it's okay for others to do the same thing, because it's the same thing manifesting differently. So we are not different. We are in nature the same. We just manifest our beliefs in a different form. Recognizing that it's a big boundary breaker.
So maybe a last one to Damian. So Damian and Bonnie, in Australia, would you say that you have succeeded breaking the boundaries among others, with these others? Are you able to assimilate? Because I think in the classroom in Australia, which I have also experienced, they are multicultural, even more than in Malaysia. Have you broken that boundary? How did you all do that? Very quickly.
It's a good question. I think if you compare to the 1950s, yes, we're way ahead of where we were once, and that happened through immigration, skilled immigration, and all those sorts of things. But can I just say the question, in assuming that it's good to eradicate boundaries, may not always be the case. It could be a case of respecting, remembering that people always have an innate sense to belong, and the boundaries are what help them belong. So, as an educator, knowing how to respect and work with boundaries that people have, that helps them feel safe in the world, and you working in ways that helps them stay safe in the world. So the boundaries might be there, but they're less significant. They're porous.
Right.
I agree.
Okay.
That's very you're on the point, Damian.
Yes.
Because boundaries do give us
yes.
Emotional safety, right?
Yes. But I like the word respect, not just to really break the boundaries, but the respect of the different cultures. Bonnie, you had anything to add to that one?
Definitely. I think
Situation in Australia.
Yeah, 3 keywords. I mean, really respect, relate, and respond. So also, make sure we bring these 3 concepts together, and that is the best way to work together.
Great. Thank you very much to our 3 panel speakers. I think time is really not on our side, and we do hope that this is not just the beginning and then the end, that this is actually the beginning of many more roundtable on aspects of culture, aspects of culture responsive teaching, for the coming months. I hope there will be more. So probably with that, I would like to pass the platform back to Denise.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Pauline, as well as professors, for that very insightful sharing. Thank you, everyone, for who shared your views.
We need to take more pictures, because there are so much more people now.
Oh yeah, sure, we can do that. We can certainly do that. Okay, so if I can,
to me, it's a big deal. I studied in Deakin, and not many people know. Although
it's a big day for you, Dr. Logan.
That's why we all that's why all together. I went for my sabbatical in Deakin, so we do have a thread in common. All of us have something in common.
So this is my first physical experience, because I did mine through distant education.
Wow.
So, and it's Geelong campus anyway.
I think Damian and I would love to welcome all of you to come to Deakin as well. And also Charlene, we have a colleagues in Malaysia who is our Deakin colleagues as well. Welcome everyone on this webinar to come and have a look of Deakin and see things in person.
Especially if you can get our bachelor's program integrated, right? That will give me an opportunity to visit.
Exactly. This is what we're working on the early childhood program, and also trying to expand to others. Look forward to that.
Yeah.
Bring me along,
exciting
Logan.
times.
Sure.
Exciting times ahead.
Okay,
all right.
Go ahead, Denise.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Goh. Okay, so we just want to take a photo again. So if we can get everybody to switch on your cameras once more and put on your pearly white teeth. Okay. All right. On the count of 3. So 3, 2, 1, say cheese. Okay, just 1. Okay, let me just move to the next page. All right. And just 1 more. Okay, got it.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you once again to everybody for your participation, as well as Dr. Goh for moderating the session, and professors for all of your insight shared with us today. So to show our appreciation, e-certificates of participation will be provided for those attending today's session. We also value your feedback, which helps us improve our events. So please take a moment to fill up our feedback form and kindly share your formal or institution email address so we can ensure that accurate distribution of e-certificates will be sent to that email address. So perhaps I can also just send the link to the chat box so that it's more convenient for you. All right. Now, as we conclude today's enriching session, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Damian, Associate Professor Bonnie, both from Deakin University, as well as Associate Professor Dr. Logan, and our dearest moderator, Associate Professor Dr. Pauline Goh, for their valuable contributions. Thank you so much, our participants, for your active engagement. Remember, our journey towards an inclusive and empowered educational environment continues, and stay connected with Taylor's University Impact Lab Education for All for upcoming events. So have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
It was lovely having everyone here.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Logendra, so I think if everything's okay, maybe we can end the session here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Denise. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Have a pleasant day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend ahead.